So the Y plus T project, as opposed to the Y plus T model, and I think we throw around model option projects around all over the place, but we were asked to deliver a project, and that's a project supported by the 3 Wairarapa councils and the Tararua Council because of Local Water Done Well. And our scope was to investigate and evaluate the benefits, opportunities and risks of joint arrangement options for water service delivery. So this is because all councils are required to look at what their practicable options are across a whole range, but how will you decide on the option? So that's why we were asked as part of this project to come up with an evaluation tool, and you'll see that we've had that peer reviewed by Castalia. So there are a list of practicable delivery options and groupings to consider. You've heard from Dougal, and he was tasked to develop one of the options. We've got Wairarapa Tararua, or the 3 Wairarapa, and for Tararua, they're actively looking at a Manawatu Whanganui 7 council option as well. So councils are looking at a whole range, and then they must assess advantages and disadvantages of at least one option if they're looking at a joint arrangement against their existing delivery model. We use that word status quo, but actually it's against your existing delivery model. And for example, for South Wairarapa, that would be a non-asset owning CCO like a Wellington Water. So similarly to the regional group, we have a project structure. We've run a parallel structure so that the decisions that have been made in the Wellington group, we don't have to repeat those. We're actually working together. We've got the same legislation that we have to work with. The same information applies to both. So we've got our advisory oversight group with Mayor Mark, Mayor Tracy Collis from Tararua, Councillor Olds and Holmes, and then Joe and Robin Patangaroa representing Kahununu. And the majority of them also sit on the Wellington Regional Oversight Group. And then we've got our 4 CEs, and then we've got the project team. So as I've described to you before, one of the differences, however, is that the Y plus T project has been run under a binding terms of reference to fund a defined scope of work, and I'll go through some more of the scope in a minute. It's led by senior staff internal to councils, as opposed to the larger, more complex project that's been led largely by an external project team led by Dougal. We're both looking at progressive decision making as we go through this, and our decisions feed into, driven to a certain extent by the timing of the exit ramps, and that's the next decision, is the exit ramp from the Wellington Regional Group or not, or keep running to, and which is what we're talking about obviously. Tararua has a similar process underway. They've got their own process they're going through, looking at their options, making a decision about which way they want to go. So our scope of work that we were given as a project team by our oversight group was to develop a joint arrangement option encompassing the 4 Wairarapa Tararua councils that's sufficiently detailed to enable it to be assessed against other options. We weren't reinventing a lot of the work that was done through the regional group that our oversight group participated in. But what's the uniqueness? What would be different with the Wairarapa and Tararua Council? We were asked to look at evidence and around how you would feed that into any decision making. So we took reports that were produced by the Regional Council and we looked at the facts that came out of that, and we looked at our experience and knowledge within a Wairarapa Tararua group. So tried to base it on facts as much as possible, but there has to be some subjective assessments as well. So we were asked to assess, create a decision-making framework, and then run an assessment, create the criteria, run an assessment, look at the Wellington Regional against the framework and the criteria and assessment, look at the Wairarapa Tararua against the framework, assessment and criteria. It's not, as I said, a competition. It's meant to be, let's look at the two. Workshop, that's what we're doing today. Workshop with elected members and iwi, and we have had a number of discussions with iwi, and just on Wednesday night we had a karo with the mana whenua from down in the South Wairarapa District Council. And then there'll be a decision on commencing further work after decisions are made. So what wasn't in our scope is we're not delving into the detailed design of the Wairarapa Tararua option, exactly what the financial arrangements were going to be, exactly what the government arrangements are going to be, what debt negotiations were going to occur, how we agree on the entering regulated asset base. That's not part of our ambit at the moment, although as there's been the same AOG, some of those principles have obviously been agreed at the Wellington Regional level and may flow into any other option as well. But that wasn't part of our scope. This will come after a decision on the joint arrangements, but we did develop that concept to evaluate against that criteria. So what is the Y plus T entity concept modelled? So it's similar to that developed under the Wellington Regional Plan. So we are also saying it would be a full breadth asset owning entity. So similar to what was on page 10 and 11 of Dougal's presentation. But there would be 4 shareholders, not 10 shareholders. And those shareholders would be the 3 Wairarapa and the Tararua councils. The location of the entity would be within the 4 district area. It would have depots in the 4 district area. The entity will have its own set of values and culture with a unique Wairarapa Tararua flavour, enhanced through careful selection of any new CEO and senior level staff, fit for purpose and right-sized IT systems. And you would have read in the report that's going to be released. And by the way, the person that we got that input from is an ex-water care person. So when we asked about the complexities of implementation of IT systems and things, the view that we got was from someone who had worked with water care. As a smaller entity, it enables a broader range of vendors that you can go to in order to put your systems in place, things like that. Because it's smaller, there's a possibility it would be less complex and easier to establish. So we assumed a start date of 1st of July 2026. Establishment costs of $5 million, which was prorated from some of the work that the Wellington Regional Group did. We've assumed that there would be a coordinated emergency response office that will be standalone, but also work closely with existing offices, such as the Wellington Regional Emergency Management Office. The 4 shareholder councils would furnish a letter of expectation to the entity, which will denote specific strategy or strategic areas they wish to influence. And the entity would work closely across a single rohe, that is Rangitane and Ngāti Kahungunu. Okay. So what was the framework we developed? Well, we used a multi-criteria analysis. Again, it's not meant to be us versus them. So we needed to identify the assessment, the criteria which each option would be evaluated against. So what's important to us? Then of those criteria, were they really important, of high importance, medium or low importance? But what did that actually mean? So what's the definition? What risk are we trying to address? or what opportunity are we trying to understand with those criteria? And then how do you decide whether it's bad, good or excellent? And so we developed an anchored scale for those criteria. Then made an assessment or investigating the criteria and assessed that, and then looked at the different options. And you'll see that we did actually run every council's existing methodology of delivery of water services through that framework, as well as a Wairarapa alone, Wairarapa plus Taurua, and the regional option. So all of them were put through that evaluation framework. So step one, which criteria to look at? So we split it into 6. And if you've read the Castalia peer review report of our framework, because they've got international experience and have worked in this water space quite a long time, they suggested that they had a slightly different set of criteria. Interestingly, though, they also had 6 areas of criteria. But we looked at the 6 of the financial, so what will impact on affordability for the consumer, a level of service, what will influence the experience for our customers, over and above just the purely legislative experience, because we know that there's a little bit more to it just than what's in the standards. Operational, so what drives efficiencies and opportunities for our districts, and I think that might go to the question actually, Councillor Helena, you asked around what's in it for the actual Masterton district. Relationships and trust, so ease to set the right values and culture to drive performance in the organisation and align with the Māori view. Strategic, what's important strategically, and which option helps us to get a sense that those things that are important will have some priority as we go forward. And finally, the legislative requirements, and that's the central government legislation requirements around local water. We do understand that there is a Joint Redress Act here in the Wairarapa to consider, and that's sat under our strategic assessment criteria. There were 41 criteria that we came up with, 23 of high criticality, 12 of medium and 6 of low. And we had our CEOs look at that, the criticality, the criteria. You'll see that we had iwi look at the Māori criteria. We asked the CFOs to look at our criteria, as well as the project team. Oh, and I also mentioned that we looked at what was happening with the work in the Waikato, Hawke's Bay, Horowhenua, Manawatu, Whanganui, when we looked at our criteria. So we did look at what are they doing in other areas in terms of setting up criteria. In terms of the what's important to Māori and to iwi, mana whenua, we put this under relationships and trust, and we asked iwi representatives to come in and develop their own criteria. We didn't develop these. So we had a separate workshop where we had representatives from Wairarapa and Taurua, Rangitāne and Kahungunu develop these criteria, these 6 criteria, and also they were all ranked of high criticality, and also how they would judge poor, good or excellent, and then they ran the models through that. We did not, they did that. So the results represent their assessment. We also thought in relationships and trust about creating economic benefits to the community over and above just the fact that the entity was here, were there flow-on impacts, and the importance of being able to actually reach out and talk to someone about performance and having clear and meaningful performance monitoring as well. So we went through that process of looking at all of those potential arrangements the existing arrangements for the existing 4 councils and the regional and the Wairarapa only. And so we ran them through a spreadsheet, which you've all got a copy of this spreadsheet. So in each of those 6 criteria areas and all of those 41 criteria, the assessment teams ranked each of those options. That flowed through into this front spreadsheet page, and then we weighted each of those 6 areas. So the initial evaluation weightings were the 20% for financial, 20% for levels of service, 15% for operational, 15% relationships, trust, strategic, and then legislation of 10% to come up with the 100. And then once that was all run through the spreadsheet, it gave each of the options a ranking. Is that a good framework? Well, we asked Castalia to have a look at it and to say, did that look like, we'd looked at the right kind of framework, the way we set up the criticality and the weightings, and provided you that peer review report. They said that they thought that the project was following a robust policy process. The project evaluation criteria support sound decision making. They offered some improvements for the next stage. So if we go forward in whichever way we go, they've given us some feedback, which is useful to have. So what were the results when these options were put through the analysis? Well, the results were that the Wairarapa only and the Wairarapa plus Tararua potential joint arrangement ranked the highest. The difference between the two probably came down to the interconnectedness of the network. Tararua and some of their network is quite a long way from here. The Wairarapa network, in terms of our 3 districts, are closer together, and that's probably the difference between them. And then the rankings of the others. But what we're interested in today, of course, is whether we continue with the regional council group, because as everybody has said today, there will have to be work done on everybody's existing arrangements, and that will have to be consulted on against any potential joint arrangement in the future. So what about those weightings that we had? We know that the financial affordability aspects are really, really important. So we did do some sensitivity analysis on the weightings. So should the levels of service have been more than a 25% rating? Should it be up there equivalent to the financial rating? Should we make financial 50% of the weighting? Should we not consider relationships and trust and remove it from the weightings? Or should you put 100% weighting on the financial aspects? And so we ran all those sensitivities through, and you've seen that in the report. It didn't really change the rankings, except when we got to the making it 100% weighting on the financial aspects. And then the regional group ranked first by, I think it was 57% to 56%. But you've got those numbers there. So talking about affordability models and tests, and I will note that affordability is not part of the legislation. They talk about financial sustainability tests, investment sufficiency and revenue sufficiency. So again, I suppose it's about being important to be clear about the language. When I talk about models here, what I'm talking about is financial models or network economic models. These are those analysis tools that are running the numbers to give you the potential trajectory of the prices in the future that you were talking about earlier with Dougal. So we actually ran with 2 potential models. There is the gravel road network economics approach, which is a top-down theoretical based on engineering theory, average pricing, and I need to clarify that. What you're getting out of gravel road is average pricing across either a region of 10 or a region of 4. It's a strategic approach about the catch-up, keep-up. We had to choose a way to compare because it's not compare, I shouldn't say compare. We're kind of getting information from 2 different places. So we said at year 10, how much would have been invested under the network economics approach in terms of capital investment program, and it's about 450 million in real terms over the first 10 years for the 3 Wairarapa councils. Now, the second approach we looked at was a funding and pricing path financial model that was originally developed under water reform under the National Transition Unit and peer reviewed to say that it worked. And then what we did is we took a bottom-up approach, project by project for each of the 4 councils, and then we ran that through this financial model to give a potential price path based on a potential investment program. So we ran that for a standalone business unit for each of the 4 councils. So we have run the numbers that said, if you do this investment program as Masterton, a standalone business unit, this is what your pricing looks like. And then we did that for Tararua, South Wairarapa and Masterton. And then we said, if we join together as a multi-council CCO and we get efficiencies around operations and leverage in the way we manage our debt, what would that look like for each of the 4 councils? And that's the graph I'll show you in a minute. So, but the key difference, I think, between the 2 approaches, which give us the same information in a different way, and I suppose what's good is that they weren't that different. So they're both giving us the information just in a slightly different way. But there was a different approach to the asset management strategy. So the network economics, as we said, was top-down, based on percentages of assets. The funding pricing path model was bottom-up, based on the local operations team looking at what they thought, project by project, it would take to deliver what we needed to invest over the next several years. This hasn't been prioritised and optimised yet. There is a difference around compliance, and I think there was a question this morning about wastewater treatment plants and having to do compliance work. So that was considered in the bottom-up approach. So there's specific compliance projects that have to happen. I think over the regional approach, they've applied a percentage for compliance over all assets. Just a different way of looking at it. So this graph here, the purpose of this, it's not so much to predict what the price is going to be, so much as it was giving us a view around, we've got 4 councils that are going to have to come together, and each of those 4 councils has a different level of debt, a different investment requirement on day one. So they're coming in a little bit unequal. There was a suggestion, and I think this flows through even the regional report, there'll have to be some kind of a negotiation coming into any councils working together. So in our, what's I think people refer to as the Townsend report, because of the consultant that did it for us, he suggested that there could be a win for everybody, a win-win-win approach. Because you could make an adjustment when you start this new entity and then start looking at your pricing going forward. So in this graph, this kind of jump on day one is around that entering adjustment. It was just a suggestion. But what you see here in relation to Masterton, which is the green, is because you have less debt coming in, you would actually have a reduction in your starting price on day one from where it is today. Now, this is just a suggestion. There is going to have to be negotiations made. And in the report, the Y plus T report, we talk about things like deciding what the regulated asset base is going to be that comes into any entity. That's going to be a negotiation. How much debt is everybody going to come into the entity? That's going to be a negotiation. So this was a suggestion based on the 4 councils with what we knew. This also says, this graph, the dotted line meaning if you were a standalone business unit, under this set of assumptions, what would it look like for you? Again, that's your green dotted line. The solid lines are saying, if you were to get together as a CCO, this is what the price would potentially look like for you. What it indicates is it could be a win for everybody. Everybody could have a win because of the operational and leverage efficiencies that you'll get by working together, and if you agree on how you're going to come together up front. That's what this graph is about. These are the gravel road graphs that you got. So these graphs, and Dougal spoke about this, these are average numbers. They're average based on the assets, the size of the assets. And this approach, the gravel road approach, the modelling is the work that's being reviewed by Castalia, and that's the information to come. And the reason this can be 30 years is because it's based on a theoretical model of averages. The work that we've done under Townsend was a project by project, looking at what are our LTP projects, and is there more that we would potentially do? And because our LTPs are 10 years, that's why we've done it with 10 years. So again, it's just 2 different approaches. But they are average numbers. So then what we said is, well, what if we averaged our numbers just so that we could see, try and compare apples to apples? And what this said is, we took those graphs that we had earlier, about the 4 councils, so that we could compare to Gravel Road. We averaged them across the 4 councils. We're not assuming there'd be amalgamation. We just wanted to be able to compare against the Gravel Road average prices. And so what this said is that the average prices, if you continue to each go alone, is the blue line, and the average prices combo is the orange line. Again, it just reflects the efficiencies of working together. All of this, as I've said, you need to note, it doesn't consider how the new entities will be thinking like a utility and will be optimising their debt and investment levels for intergenerational equity. All that has to be thought through, and the use of debt and leveraging your debt to smooth the prices for your customers in the future. And these numbers are also, the numbers that we ran through these models are based on a significant increase in investment. So for South Wairarapa, our last LTP had $54 million of investment over 10 years. The numbers I've shown you up here for South Wairarapa are $177 million of investment for South Wairarapa. So I need to be clear that this is a significant increase in investment. Doesn't mean we have to do it. And I believe what we're going to get out of the DIA in the future, when they're running some numbers, and they will talk to this, is that there is there debt room capacity to do things when we need to do things. So that's their approach. So there's going to be 3 approaches. So out of those models, we can get imputed price path by model, and these are models, so this is what and assumptions. And we took year 10 of any new entity as a comparison point for the purposes of this evaluation process only, and saying, okay, what would prices be for a consumer? And so that first graph I showed you by each council, as a CCO, there were prices or tariffs, I'll call them tariffs, ranging from $2,500 to $5,500. If you average that averaged to less under $4,000. Under the gravel road network economic model for the Wairarapa councils averaged, it was $4,960, and for the regional entity averaged at year 10, it was $4,200. Those are averages that are so just so we can compare them all by average. Now, I know there's a lot of interest in the fact that today's rates bill will be split into two bills in the future, and there will be a water services charge bill and there will be a remaining rates bill. And how do we get from here to there? What we have been doing in the Y+T project is we've been preparing what we're calling waterfalls. Waterfalls which are a graphical representation of if you have a rates bill made up of two parts today and you split them apart into a CCO and council rates in the future, what does that look like and what's driving the differences in those two things? So there is going to be more investment in a new water services entity that will mean tariffs might go up. But as a CCO compared to standalone, you're getting efficiencies which will take it lower than if you tried to do it by yourself. So we're preparing these they will be in our future reports. And you would expect that once you've removed water services and the debt from the council, that the remaining rates bill, apples to apples, should go down. So those numbers are coming. So we hear a lot about economies of scale and scope and whether they'll apply to being larger or not. So there are opportunities around economies and scale and scope in being larger. We're not denying that, but there are also some limitations to that. So we considered multiple factors in that assessment, that framework, in the criteria. So implementation, feasibility and complexity versus scale, and that was that advice that we received from the ex-Water Care, ex-National Transition person who's got experience in bringing these kind of entities together and establishing them from a systems and IT and data perspective. And is bigger always better, or does it also bring some complexity and risk? We thought about climate change, resilience and adaptability, and if we were smaller and located here on this side of the hill, would that be better than if we also had to work with the people from Wellington? And in addition, the people in Wellington, they've got issues around ingress of salt water into their pipe network that's happening. We've got issues here around water storage and resilience and sustainability. So would we be prioritising those things? We thought about what the regional council may think about this. We thought about the operational benefits of scale. And yes, in those bigger entities such as a Wellington Regional Group, some professionals may choose to be in a large organisation with more opportunities. Some might choose to come over into a more relaxed rural area to work. But there are benefits and opportunities to each way. Can we deliver? Will each of these options be able to attract large contractors to deliver projects or not? So the procurement aspects. What's unique about Wairarapa Tararua and our network, and would each of the potential joint arrangements be able to deliver or give us those same economies of scale and scope? And how would a new entity be delivered? And I think a number of those things have been addressed in the Y+T report. So what differentiates the regional and provincial options in the evaluation outcomes seen that have come through into those rankings? Or you could flip this around and say, what are the benefits of a Y+T model? But we've tried to not be pros and cons too much, but Dougal's slide did have a benefit in it. So it seemed that the benefit of the YT model that came out of the evaluation was that iwi and the fact that there was a single rohe that would be represented in terms of how this was going to be put together in the future, and the fact that we have our Joint Redress Act, the Moana Statutory Board that's very important up here, would be in a Y+T with the 4 shareholding groups would be supported more than the regional, or prioritised, I should say. So through things like shareholder letters of expectation, there could be influence to drive key strategic initiatives that are important to the Wairarapa and the Tararua, such as our water resilience strategy and the need for storage and how we're going to work together to deliver storage to our region. The ability to influence culture and deliver accountability locally. It's really good to be able to reach out and touch. When things don't go well, you want to know who to talk to. You want to be able to reach out and touch those people, and you want to know who the decision makers are and where the head office is. The logic of spatially similar sub-regions being able to have a coordinated response to emergencies and standardised solutions for assets. Now, as we were doing this evaluation, it was just after the flooding up in Wairoa, and what came to mind is how the local people had knowledge about the river and the river mouth and what should happen, but the big regional council didn't do that. And so I suppose having localised coordinated responses to emergencies connected to the community was what we were thinking in that space. Right-sized, fit-for-purpose systems and processes can lead to innovation and cost efficiencies. I've talked about that. The complexity and risk in establishment. And I will, one little thing that when we looked at things and when we were assessing, for example, the financial part of things, I understand, and Dougal can confirm, but the costs of establishing this new Wellington regional option, which could be 75 to 125 million, are not in your pricing models right now? No, they're not in there. Our 5 million is in our model, but I didn't think they were in the regional models. And that ability to have strategic options in the future, that question of do you go small and join up in the future? Do you go small and bring in shared services from a centre of excellence at another entity? And I've heard, for example, that down in the South Island in Otago, they're thinking about creating a centre of excellence for IT systems that you could potentially have shared services with. So strategically, how do you position yourself for the future? And how important is that? And also the fact that this project, Y+T at the moment, you've got a good core group of professionals here in the area that could move into any entity in the future, so an enduring project team. Going back to that strategic options, there is options that you could move very quickly to start a CCO. 3 of the 4 councils currently have their own services, so it's not extracting themselves out of Wellington Water. South Wairarapa is going to have to extract themselves out of Wellington Water in the future. So the question is, has the Y+T project team got it right? And when I say that, what I mean is, have we given you robust, good information in order to help you make decisions? That's what I'm asking. I'm not saying, have we got it right, you must do Y plus T. Sorry. So have we given you enough information? And there is still some information to come. And as was mentioned, our report is in draft because some of the information hasn't yet come, but it will be released. So we've looked at what was our scope, and did we deliver on our scope, which was more than just developing one option. The framework, the criteria, the evaluations, the weightings, is that robust enough for you? And we did get that peer reviewed to make sure, give some feedback on that. We hope we've taken on the feedback that we've heard through all of our council meetings. And how do we feel about it? Well, as a team, I think we feel that the fact that we've got a very short time and we're never going to be able to give or get all the information, hopefully we've done a pretty good job at this time, noting that there's more to come. So Dougal's slide did talk about, sorry, going the wrong way, what's next. So I won't go over that again, except obviously there's no decisions today. There is that decision on the Wellington Regional off-ramp, and that's the thing that you'll be considering. So to go back to my favourite book of Māori proverbs, I think this is a good closing one about keeping us all close together no matter who we work with, regionally or in the Wairarapa Tararua, and not far apart. So I'll pause for questions now and invite my other project team members to come up.
Cool. So I've got Craig, then Brent, then Bex. For the presentation. Same kind of questions as I asked earlier. Okay, so in your presentation, it looked like there's the ability to do the X and Y scenario where one is not paying for the other. When we talk around, you showed graphs of how the councils would start and where they could end if they were together. There's the ability for that to possibly be done?
I think Craig's asking around the harmonisation.
Yeah, so we're not making any assumptions around harmonisation. What we assumed was that when you come in, you're going to have some negotiations when you come in to any entity. Then the new board is going to have to determine what's going to be happening with future prices alongside the economic regulator who's interested in least cost delivery of the right services to the community. So that's the approach that we looked at, but we did need to say, well, if you did it as a standalone business unit, what would it look like? And then if you did it as a multi-CCO, what would it look like? But we haven't assumed harmonisation.
Yeah, so second question, I can ask about levels of service. If this was to progress with YT or Y or whatever, when do you think the ratepayer could see an increase in the level of service?
Happy to answer that. I think, thanks Councillor Boyer, I think that will come down to the investment profile and what the strategy is around that. So the entity will determine what they want to spend when and what those levels of service may be. As long as you've got sufficient headroom, if you're wanting to make improvements in that space, then you'll be able to.
And last question, governance. Now, we saw that there would be clear separation. Is there going to be the same separation? I couldn't quite, on your slide, I wasn't quite so sure where you were heading on that.
What I said was the principles around governance and how that CCO would look. We haven't delved into the details, but for our assumptions, they were similar to what the regional model is assuming at this time. But we haven't taken it down into a whole lot of detail, and because those principles were all created through the advisory oversight group, which is identical to ours, we've assumed the same at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
You've assumed economies of scale over, us going alone and joining together. Is that correct?
We've assumed operational efficiencies and efficiencies in the way that we can deliver projects as a group, yes.
Oh, okay. I just wondered because I thought...
Can you speak up a little bit?
Oh, sorry. The Wellington Regional one, if I got it right, deliberately left that out of theirs. So it just...
Yes, you're right. In terms of operational efficiencies, we assumed that those operational efficiencies, which I think are about 1.8% a year, didn't kick in until year 4. And when we went through the evaluation process, we marked the Wairepa Tararua option lower than the Wellington regional option because you don't want to depend on efficiencies to be financially sustainable. So the Wellington region actually ranked higher in our evaluation because of that.
And when you mention emergency responses, I always think that be it earthquake or flood are probably the biggest risks we face, and they tend to be quite localised in that, we might have one in Masterton and it might affect some of the surrounding area, but it doesn't really touch Wellington to anywhere near the same extent. And likewise, especially with flooding, which is our most frequent higher risk. So I thought that the emergency response issue would place the biggest model far ahead of if we have an earthquake or Wairepa flooding issue. It would be having to cope with it more by ourselves. I just wonder if you could comment on that, the localised versus being part of a bigger structure.
Well, I think it's about the coordination of the response and whether that's here locally or whether it's based in Wellington, and also access to any resources that you may need to help, and whether they're located over the hill and have to be brought over to here or not. I think you've got a great example of that at the moment in your response from the cyclone last year, and the fact that you've got the recovery office based right here in the Wairepa. And I had an opportunity to see a presentation by your program manager around that and ask the question, well, what if this response was located out of Wellington? And I think the view was that it's much more important for it to be located locally. So I suppose that's the kind of things that we were thinking about.
In your report on page 41, you discuss the principles will be established by the project team, PSG and AOG. And this also applies to the key deliverables, program principles, governance structure, budget, work program and contract engagements. I just wonder has it been thought about, will councillors be having any input into that, or is it confined to AOG, PSG project?
That comment was, or statement is reflecting the current agreement under the memorandums of understanding in terms of reference of the respective projects where those things have been delegated from council through to your members sitting on the AOG and the PSG. So that's just a artefact of the existing arrangements, and if they wanted to be changed, that would be to the councils to decide they want to change that going forward.
Councillor, probably also to note, so the AOG does have elected members sitting on it, representative, well, one from each council, with the view that that's the conduit back into council. But yes, to the point that that's the existing arrangement.
Okay. And I've mentioned it before, the 10-year view versus the 35, 40-year view. You know, I do find that very limiting. We put a wastewater consent that just sits right outside the 10-year view, and those sort of things can turn into $64 million questions, and you know, I like the long term on asset management because it tends to pick up those consent areas and differences. So, I mean, I would rather see your stuff on a much longer time scale, if that can happen.
Thank you, Councillor Goodwin. We won't be extending past the 10 years, because if we do that, then the regional group will need to do that also.
They have. They don't do the 10-year one unless I'm, you know, most of theirs is over about 40 years.
It's at a different level of detail.
Yeah, okay.
Unless instructed, we won't be doing that.
Yes. And that's probably, oh, well, no, I'll ask you the question. I actually asked Dougal, don't you think it would be easier to, would it be easier to initially join the biggest one, you know, just say you're a blind optimist and think that's wonderful, and if down the road you are not happy, you can come back to a smaller one, which strikes me as a much easier path than joining a smaller one and finding that maybe people are brassed off because, you know, people over there are paying a lot less money and you want to join them. I just would have thought that's a harder path.
I'm going to take off my Y+T project hat and put on my South Wairarapa District Council hat, where we join Wellington Water as a single council. No, it is not easy to extract yourself once you're in a large group. They usually have contracts that require extended termination clauses, and also you've lost a lot of your in-house capability, and going back to that is quite difficult to do. But Maz has got a comment as well.
And I'll take my project hat off too and advise as GM of INA, and that advice would be, if you have got an extended period before you want to stand up an entity, before you want to get some efficiencies, then you may consider going into a big one. But my advice would be, if you want to get some runs on the board and start getting some efficiencies and making the most of that headroom, then you would be best to start smaller, and that is because you can move at pace and you're more agile because of a number of the benefits that were put up.
So I'm interpreting that as a maybe short-term versus long-term approach.
I think we've made it pretty clear that, you know, there are a number of options, and one option may be that you always have the long view in mind, but you want to step into that. And other councils may very well be doing the same, and it may be that if you assume you go into a smaller entity, that entity then goes into a bigger one, or it may be that other smaller entities want to join your entity.
Let's give Bex a chance to ask some
Yep.
questions.
Okay, you had a slide on there which talked about average costs, and you talked about comparing apples with apples. W&T though was 4960 at year 2037, and Wellington was year 2027.
That's it.
So why was there a 10-year difference?
No, sorry, that must be a typo, sorry. There
Oh
should
no,
be-
that's
yes,
right,
typo.
because I thought that was a bit weird.
Yeah.
Okay, my next question is, and caught me by surprise when you said that the establishment costs for Wellington was 75 to 125 million, but they weren't including in the financial implications.
Yep.
So that's a red flag to me. But my question is, some of the concerns that have come out earlier in the day are about prioritising work, about local voice, and about iwi participation and engagement. Do you believe that those three things can be addressed easier with a local model?
Look, it's always going to come down to the board that you put in place, which is under the models. There is going to be an appointment process around that shareholders will most likely have a role in. It's always going to come down to the board you have in place, the statement of expectations that you put in place, and your staff and all the rest of it. So those are the important things. It's going to be the 4 Wairarapa councils doing all those things versus a 10 council group. So and for the views, there was a statement earlier about tipping point, I think, and I made this statement the other day, which people probably thought, what is she talking about? Mm-hmm. But Malcolm Gladwell, in terms of tipping points, he talks about the 30% rule. So once you get to 30% of anything, people start taking notice of you. In the Wellington Regional Group, I think will be about 15%. In the Wairarapa Tararua, we're the Wairarapa Tararua. So take the implication from there.
So you could determine, for instance, that you'd like 2 iwi representatives on the board?
That's going to be through all of the more detailed design that's going to happen, yeah.
You can have those discussions.
Well, we've certainly included both iwi in our AOG.
Thank you.
Can I just respond to...
Robin, thank you so much.
Can I just make another comment on that, Councillor Johnson? I think the only exclusion in regards to the board is that you cannot be a council representative.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation, Robin. A lot of the concentration on the presentation, a lot of the wordings around about Wairarapa and Tararua, but if Tararua drops out and we become 3 Wairarapa, it doesn't change a lot from what you presented to us.
Yeah, we did. We looked at what's the critical mass, and the critical mass is 3 councils.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Marama.
Kia ora, thank you for your presentation and giving us the opportunity to ask questions. My questions are fairly basic, and I wonder, Harriet, if you mind going back to the graph where the 4 councils? Or
The one with the bold
Yeah.
solid and the... Yeah, that one.
Could you explain that to me? Is it because is it every, that's a debt for each council, or is it each connection? Or?
No, it's by council. It's so if you had a standalone business unit, so under the legislation you can't deliver water in the future the way you currently do, embedded in your existing council. You're going to have some kind of a standalone business unit delivering. So it's going to have to be ring-fenced from your existing council operations. You could go to a single council-controlled organisation, but you're putting a lot of cost into that organisation that you don't need for one council. So the dotted line is a standalone business unit. So that's a projection for each council individually if they had a standalone business unit. Does that make sense?
So this one here, if you look at Masterton, this is showing that if Masterton was on its own, it's this dotted green line, and this is the cost per ratepayer.
Obviously, I was reading it wrong. I thought that was, they were in order, and I thought Masterton was the top green one.
No. Oh, this is us here. And if this is saying if we go combined, the costs look like this.
All right.
So that's the variable, the difference there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. But the other thing that graph says is that in the 4 councils getting together, there could be a win-win-win for everybody, because we're all going to be better off if we make that beginning kind of adjustment on our starting prices.
But also, wasn't that based on debt negotiation as well?
That's all part of it, because all of that's going to have to be negotiated, and I suppose that goes to complexity as well. So what is the value of assets that are coming in, how much debt is coming in, that all has to be worked through, whether you're a 4 or a 10 council, and there will be some negotiation.
My next question is, in your presentation, you talked about looking at several different areas, like Waikato, one over
Yes, Manawatu, Whanganui, Hawke's Bay. So when we said, well, what criteria should we use, we looked at the criteria that were being used by other council groups. So we got some presentations that have been made by other, so not council groups, project teams in creating their evaluation frameworks, and that was part of how we came up with the criteria.
And my last, take this up, is kind of a statement, but I want to thank you for engaging iwi early in the process, instead of often we're invited in when it's almost completed. So, just want to thank you.
More questions? Tom?
Thanks, thanks, Robin and Les. For me, the price seems pretty important, and as you will have heard from previous discussions, a very transparent process is pretty important for me, but I won't go there for now. In terms of pricing, have I got this right? So at the 10-year point on page 27, are you saying that the average price for the Y plus T is less than 4,000, and for the regional model it's 4,900 at the 10-year point? Is that what those figures are saying?
Yes. Not that we
Given what you know.
well, what I'm saying is we didn't run our financial model on averages. That wasn't the basis. It was project by project, build it up, council by council. But when the gravel road was all done on averages, we felt we needed to, what's the average? And that's why we ran that graph, because you do need to be able to look at the two. So that's where that came from.
So based on the averages that you guys have come up with over 10 years, you're better pricing of option than
On a different set of assumptions and a different investment strategy.
Thanks for clarifying that.
But can I just ask a follow-up question, Tom, and come back to you? But doesn't the Wairaparenti model include establishment costs and the Wellington one doesn't?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So it's not apples with apples, is it?
Just what I want to clarify that, so you will be currently in your concept project.
Yes, it's an approach.
There's no pricing differences planned for the different councils, given their current standalone and common combo costs?
No different.
You don't have a pricing differential for the different
Oh,
councils?
sorry, a principle of holding a pricing differential for 3 years. We haven't gone into that detail, but the AOG for the Wellington region came up with that principle. The AOG for the Y plus T will probably want to, I won't speak for them, but they may like to carry that principle over. They're the same people, but that's not something that as a project team we have looked at.
That's one of those things, Councillor Helena, who are, that's one of those things that are up for grabs. Yeah.
And so that's a really cool graph, that one, I think, because I think it sort of says a lot around the advantages of combining. But then when you go to your next graph, was it the one before?
That's not our, that's the gravel road graphs, yeah.
27,
This one,
no,
Tom.
the next one above that.
Next one, Harriet?
What happened to total average?
This one, the average.
So what you're saying there is average prices solo, sitting above average prices combo. So there's economies of scale, efficiencies, whatever.
Yes.
However you define those things. But that's only achievable because when you talk about win-win-win, you talk about 3 wins, and I'm wondering if there's one council that doesn't win. Is that Masterton District Council? Who ends up subsidising those other costs?
No.
Win off.
And actually, in the report, I think it does say win-win-win-win. It is a 4-win. It's a 4-win.
But it's based on Masterton District Council subsidising the other regions.
No, Masterton District Council, this is just an artefact that we said, well, if they're doing an averages, we should average. Take more, I would advise that first graph that you found very useful is the more important graph. And you will see actually Masterton gets a deduction in their starting price because of the better situation with Masterton versus the other 3 councils, but the other 3 councils still get a win because they're better off going together than if they were single. So all we did is we just wanted to, because Gravel Road we're talking averages, we said, well, we better average something so we can compare the 2 numbers. But that first graph is the better one. And in that, Masterton wins because they start off with a lower price. It's a reduction.
So in 10 years, the Masterton cost per connection is about $2,000. Is that what that's saying?
Yes.
Yeah. And so is that what, let's assuming these figures are exactly right, is that what Masterton water users would be paying?
I can't tell you that because the economic regulator is going to work with the entity. These numbers are saying that based on those assumptions, investment program, and without the economic regulator in place. But based on this financial model, that's what it's saying, yes.
But given there's no differential pricing in mind at the moment, that's probably going to be averaged out and it's going to be pushed up and the other one's brought down, depending on what principles that is adopted.
Well,
is that right, or am I way off course with my maths?
No, I just, Robert and I are not going to commit to anything, Councillor, in that regard, because, you know, these numbers are absolute best efforts. I think what will help the conversation is when we receive the work that DIA are focusing on at the moment, and they may be able to talk to that, they may not because it's still in progress. That is certainly going to be useful for all of you, and that will be individual councils, and it will then be Y plus T.
Okay.
Oh, and so, another question, or 2 more questions. Over that 10-year period, how much investment has been made, and you know this if we know the regulations that you're expected to meet, but what proportion of the investment is made after 10 years in your project compared to what's necessary to get us to the potential standard the government's asking for us?
So in
Does that make sense?
in the financial model that underpins this graph, it's $424 million of investment for the 3 Wairepa councils, and that was based on the asset management plans that each council had in place, with a discussion with the operations team at those councils about what would be required to reach the regulated standards and forecast standards in the future. They made their best assessment of that, and that's where the $424 million came from over 10 years.
And sorry, that 420 million will get us to that standard.
That's the best view of the operational staff currently, remembering that some of those standards haven't been released yet.
And so if that happens to play out in reality, will those graphs then flatten off and potentially drop down?
Ooh.
Well, again, I think that
After
is,
10 years?
it's going to depend on the investment structure and the strategy of that, because when you see, again, the DIA information, I think it will indicate that there could potentially be different things that we could do with the headroom, with the money, and some smarter ways to invest. So logic would say, well, if the legislative changes are really intense and more than what we've allowed, then it could go up, or if they're less, it could go down. But I think,
If it's the same?
well, if this is right, then we'd say,
Or dropping?
if it was the same, aligned with our assumptions, then you'd see that it would be the same, but over time you'd expect some efficiencies.
Of those graphs over time. Yeah, I'm just trying to understand how you've shaped that up. Just the last thing, am I right in understanding that Wellington Water owns South Wairarapa assets?
No.
So what is it that South Wairarapa will have to negotiate to make this model and work costly for the rest of us?
We're currently on a 1-year extension to the management services agreement with Wellington Water. We have no staff at South Wairarapa, so you're going to have to build up all your staff and your knowledge again. So there's those things that you have to deal with.
David and then Bex.
Thank you, and I just wanted to thank you both and your committee for what you've done, presenting all this, and Dougal as well. One question I've got, the first question I've got is to do with the Wainera water scheme. Sorry, Maz. It's owned, well, it was built by farmers 40 odd years ago, but it's run by the district council. I wonder what happens to that. And the other thing, what is going to happen, we have in our long-term plan development of at Kaituna of more storage dams for water, and Wainara with Carlton come under the same umbrella. I wonder, how do we get ourselves over all those problems?
In terms of, you've got water scheme, we've got water races down in Masterton and South Wairarapa.
One water race too.
Yeah, you've got water race as well. So there's no requirement for those to be managed by any new entity, but it would seem to be a real opportunity for a professional water utility that has staff to provide a service to the councils to manage them on your behalf. That would seem to be a real opportunity. Your second question.
Yes, can I?
And Carlton.
I'll deal with Wainuiru last, but in terms of the big schemes and or the large CapEx projects, there will always be some outliers that we'll have to discuss, but just generally they would move, that work would move into the entity, and it would be that entity's work to understand the viability of that solution, the whole business case, etc. So I see that as being status quo, but just moving to where it belongs. In terms of Wainuiaru, there will be some outliers, but that scheme is owned by the District Council because it is a registered scheme. There are some unusual nuances around it because of the community arrangement. There will always be the odd thing like that we'll have to work through as part of the transition. But as Robin says, it would make sense that your centre of excellence, where your power and might is in terms of your three waters, you would be wanting them to take care of these outliers for you also.
Yeah, my concern is that the cost of water might be prohibitive for the farming fraternity. That's my concern.
We probably have to have an offline
it's fair enough,
conversation about those.
That's fine. Thank you.
If disaster struck, cyclone, natural disaster, or a network in one of the towns failed, would we have sufficient headroom to bring on additional debt if it was just the four councils?
What we're seeing at this time is we would have a reasonable bucket that we could dip into before we would have to look over the hill. That's a really good question that will be answered, I think, when we get the information from DIA.
Yeah, because, life's unpredictable.
Yeah.
And, further to Brent's comments, you don't want to be so small that you haven't got any wriggle room. So
Yes.
that's great.
Yep.
Thank you.
Can I read from that graph up there that Masterton, for the first 2 years, the ratepayers will pay less than those ratepayers in the other councils?
Well, you are interpreting that right, Marama, but again, that all depends on the strategy that the organisation wishes to adopt. They may have some areas where they can launch off, where they can make a decision, do we want to reduce rates or do we want to do more work faster, do we want to speed things up? Do we want to make sure our headroom for civil defence is massive, but you're interpreting that correct?
I'm sorry, you've already answered the question. Yes.
Gary?
One of the things that I looked at in terms of the key drivers for your project was the ability you've got here, the ability to influence and deliver accountability, which I find really important. Could you explain that a bit further, just in one line, of how you would see yourselves having that ability?
I went to a presentation by, and I don't want to get political, obviously, but Bill English at a forum a little while ago, and he said what was really important in the Christchurch earthquake was that you knew who the decision makers were, that you could walk into the door and know who they are. I think sometimes in large organisations it's hard to find out who the decision makers are and who to walk through the door and talk to. And so I think we were thinking about the fact that the people in this Wairepa Plus T entity living and working in the community, and the head office was here and depots and all those things. I think some of that was reflected in those comments.
Thank you. Do I think Brent and then Tim and then Craig?
You were talking before about that 424 million that you looked at of the LTAs, whereas on page 13 of the Matthew Townsend report, he lists the infrastructure deficits at 706 million for the four councils, Masterton's being the lowest at 171 million, lowest per capita, and South Wairarapa, for instance, being the highest So I just wonder if you could talk about, well, you talked a bit about your 424 and what that means, and there's been a considerable difference with this seemingly acknowledged infrastructure deficit, which they put some numbers on.
Yeah, there's two parts to that. We had to, in the Townsend report, he obviously had the 4 councils, so we had to deduct Tararua. And the other thing is the gravel road, they've only used real dollars in real terms. They have no inflation applied to any of their dollars. And so we have both nominal and real terms. And so when we talked the 450 and the 424, we wanted to make sure we were talking in real terms for both, and that it was 3 councils and not the 4, which would have been the 700 odd million.
And in that graph up there, if I interpret it right, my understanding is that ultimately we end up with a unified price, but the difference between, at the right-hand side of the graph, where 2,000 is the cheapest price, and up above it, the highest is 7, so maybe I'm being simplistic here, but if I average that, there's only one council below that average line, which is Masterton. And, that I assume, from what I've read, that there is going to be price smoothing.
The highest is actually 5, Brent, because you've got to look at the solid line, not the broken line.
Oh, I don't want to argue the details, but
Well, it's quite a
all I'm
big
saying
difference.
is
Don't let the truth get in the way of what you're saying.
it's that fear of, just for example, and I'm not picking on you,
Just use your own figures again.
Masterton subsidising.
I think
Whatever.
I think in that regard, anything is possible, but until the economic regulations are out, and there is direction in that, and there may not be any direction around harmonised tariffs, it's probably best not to make any assumptions.
I do want to say
Well,
one
because
thing.
they certainly have in Dougal's report, where they merge the prices, that is very much evident, and really until I hear this from you guys, I haven't thought that there's any option but to merge your prices, whether you do it on, 3.5 years after the start, or 5.5 or 10 years after the start. That's why I like this 30-year look.
So it's not legislated to merge the prices, and your incoming negotiations aren't legislated. That's up to the councils to decide. But actually, I have to support your 30-year, although we're not going to do it because of the level of detail. But in the high prices there for the South Wairarapa Council, there's 3 wastewater treatment plant upgrades and happening in those 10 years, which is why it's so expensive. But then they'll have new wastewater treatment plants and new consents, and so they won't be as expensive in the next 10 years.
And then we'll need ours.
And then you'll need yours. And then,
We need one.
yeah. And so, so there will be periods of years when different councils need more over that time. And that's all the stuff that a new entity will have to look at, is how they prioritise, have a portfolio view of all of the projects that have to be delivered, when they need to be delivered, what that's going to cost, all of those things. Yes.
But again, I took something which I hadn't thought of from Dougal's presentation of, with a much bigger entity, it is possible to say, well, look, we need to reconsent this wastewater plant, but it's in the wrong place. Now, for a small council like us, you would never contemplate that. The costs are too high. Whereas, as Dougal said, for a large organisation, you can make those very long-term strategic decisions, the smaller entities simply can't. They're too dramatic.
Just give Tim an opportunity to ask some questions.
Thank you. Brent, you were quite inaccurate, those figures you read before in that graph. The top line is only 2.5 times more than the other line. Just making that point.
Okay.
2.5 times as much between Masterton and the other councils. 2.5 times.
Do you want to say it again, Tim?
Well,
How much? I'm very hard of hearing. I didn't hear
Tick
that.
tock.
so the Masterton, the other ones are 2.5 times higher than Masterton's.
Oh.
And with that graph, did you show that in the other presentations? And what was the reaction from their councils that you did?
Oh, you mean to
To
yesterday?
South Warringah District Council.
Yeah, we're doing exactly the same presentation today as we did yesterday.
Yeah.
There was a lot more discussion yesterday around affordability as versus price predictions, because these are just predictions. So there was a lot more discussion, and I think Dougal would say each council has different flavour to same presentations but different flavour of discussions. So yesterday it was just affordability. Doesn't matter what price is it affordable?
But around that particular slide, there wasn't this big discussion. You talk a lot about being quick and nimble at the beginning of your presentation in regards to being smaller. Where does that threshold stop? So we talk about being smaller compared to the model that Dougal presented this morning. For example, we talk about Y plus T, and if Tararua pulled out of our one, could it work that Tararua, South Warringah and Masterton went alone as the three, or was it reliant on Masterton being part of it?
Well, this is my personal view. I don't necessarily think there's any kingmaker. And we I don't think there's any king or queen maker. You know, we've looked at this through the lens of the four. I understand your question about, you know, when does the ability to move with agility run out? And it's hard to be definitive, but if I used Wellington Water as an example versus a smaller company of maybe 100 staff or less, you would be moving much faster in the smaller organisation because you don't have the same level of bureaucracy. As Robin was saying, you've got different touch points, you can make decisions faster. So on.
Just going back to my other question, in your view, if there's the four councils involved in the Y plus T model, if Masterton chose not to be, if Tararua wasn't in that model, you've said today that the model would still be sustainable, but if Masterton wasn't in that model and it was South Warringah, Masterton and Tararua, that would still be a viable model as well?
I'm not sure we have enough information to say that.
What do you think?
Well, no, I'm not going to say what I think actually, because you'll probably quote me, and I may be wrong.
I think it's an important question for people to consider here. We're not all for the same councils, and if you're saying, you did say that if Tararua was out, that would be fine, but if we were out, would it still be a viable option? And if it's not, then it's not a viable option as a whole.
Well,
do you see my point?
I don't.
No.
No. Okay. We said...
We're here discussing Masterton.
Yeah, no, we're talking about four councils. Part of the presentation from Robin and Maz was that if Tararua wasn't part of it, if it was just South Wairarapa, Masterton and Masterton, it would still be a sustainable model.
And we know that because that was the original piece of work that we started working on before Tararua signed the terms of reference.
Okay. Let's say if it was Tararua, South Wairarapa and Masterton, would it still be a sustainable model? Or is the model dependent on Masterton being one of the three or four? Do you must understand what I'm saying?
I think from a financial sustainability point of view, it would still be sustainable, but is it optimal? And so I know that indications from are that each alone is sustainable. It doesn't mean it's optimal. So going alone is sustainable from a financial sustainability in terms of the intent of the legislation, but that doesn't mean that it's optimal. And the same with whether Masterton was in or out.
To me, it should be an answer you should be able to give just like that. You
But
know,
I think the question is it more optimal for that grouping for
Yeah.
Masterton, is it?
That's right.
And the answer is yes.
Yeah.
and that's my question. Thank you.
Can I just ask a quick one? Can I, just based on those graphs again, they do include the debt levels and the investment levels and the levels of service for 10 years?
Yes.
That's what they're
Yeah.
To Craig and then Bex.
So these graphs as well, and it's probably a question for Dougal as well. In both your assessments, have you taken into account predicted population growth and the effects of that? You're nodding your head.
Yes. Yes.
And my question on this graph is, at the moment, Carterton rates are the highest. Jeff? Is he still there?
Water rates?
Oh, you're not allowed to say.
General rate.
But on this graph, and I know it's only one model, South Wairarapa District Council's rates are the highest. Is that because of their current debt level, or is that because of their proposed long-term plan projects?
It's because of the investment program that was put into this model, which, as I said, was $177 million.
Okay, thank you.
Brett.
I was interested to hear you say at the presentation in Martinborough yesterday, the difference in the questions that you were fielding. Is that, you were saying it was a bit different from this today, that their questions were around, I'm just asking you, because you do say on page 36 of your report, and I won't comment, I'm just quoting it, we are all like-minded folk around here. So I'm just curious that maybe we're not, if we ask different questions.
Is that a question?
What's the question, Councillor?
Are we sheep or not?
I'm
So we've asked a lot of different questions
I'm
around
just
here today,
asking
Councillor.
you what their questions, I'm asking you to repeat what their questioning was about, and I can't remember what you said.
The primary focus was around, the discussion was around affordability.
Affordability, right.
Which I would have thought that the primary discussion around here has been around affordability, but just put in a different way, that's all.
All about the dollars.
Any other questions before we release Maz and Robin and give our friends from the DIA who've been sitting here very patiently for 3 hours?
One more question for me.
One minute.
Just in regards to, you mentioned as a team, and in the team is Kim, David and Maz. So as a council, there'll be no narrative pushing a particular plan.
Kim, David and Maz. So
Kim's in the team we saw at the beginning. You've got Kim in there, our CE, Maz, who's on the LLT, and David, a councillor.
So I think, so we go back to that. So there was set up with an AOG, project steering group and the project team. So the advisory group, you've got the names up there again.
Yeah.
So you've got representation in terms of elected members in the advisory group and Iwi representation. Then the project steering committee is your 3 CEs.
Yeah.
And then the project team comprised staff. Because the councils in the Wairarapa wanted to get a view on what a potential entity might look like in the Wairarapa, being that there was also this work, which we were part of and are part of, around a Wellington option. So that's the group that has done that.
Great, so there's no preferred model from council staff.
No,
You're looking at this completely objectively.
Absolutely.
It's really good to hear. Thanks.
Aren't we all?
Aren't we all?
Of course we are. Just want all the information shared with us.
And as an
Never
open
got from you, Gary. The federals
All right, we done? Oh, sorry, no, we got Tom.
Robin, I might have misheard you, but did you say, I know you've done comparisons using your criteria, the different makeups within the Waralapa, different combos, individual councils going alone. Have you done reports on all of those?
No.
On any of them at all?
So our project, the project was to do a report on the Wellington region versus the Wairarapa Tararua. Each council is eventually going to have to consult on their existing delivery methodology versus a preferred option. That was out of scope of our project.
So we've got Brent and then Margaret.
No.
Oh, no, just Brent. Oh, David.
No, I'm fine, thank you.
Just Brent.
I just wanted to ask, with the questions yesterday, you may have been asked, and I've already asked it of some of our staff, do you think your council, or do your questioners yesterday, do they want these reports released to them, the public? And do you think that will be soon?
So, Councillor, I think we've been there already. So,
Well, I heard your view, but you're not part of
No,
that.
I think the key
They're all
point here,
become
Councillor, is the
public.
decision to release those reports will be by the CEs and not by the project group. That's not their responsibility. They've delivered their responsibility
Oh, okay.
and the project that they were asked to do.
All right, yep.
All right, let's get DIA up here, huh?
Can we have just 2 minutes?
2-minute break.
2 minutes, yeah.
Legally. Legally released.
Somebody's asking too many questions. Someone's gone to sleep, Brett. To come out next Monday. We get them out 3 days.
Thank you. Thanks very much. No, not a problem at all.
I
Sorry for getting your names wrong before, too.
What, the cooking box has been launched, and it's been...
Not really.
So there's dust clouds, you get the beat of dust.
Here we go, guys. Good discussion. Bring your egos. Harriet? Harriet?
Sorry.
Are we still live? Are we still live? Are we still live? Everyone's screaming to the
Let's get going.
Well, the boys are up there.
I know.
I've been sifting on the food.
The questions are going to be
Thank you. You asked my wife.
All right, should we come back together? All right, we've had the dessert in the main, and we're on to the entree. Something like that. So we've got Jared, Phil and Joseph from DIA. Opportunity to hear from them and obviously then ask any questions that you might like to ask.
Thanks very much, Corin. Your Worship, Councillors, thanks for the opportunity to be here today. My name is Jared Shaw. I'm a Chief Advisor at Department of Internal Affairs, joined today by my colleagues Joe Lumberg and Philip Biles. We have been invited here today and very grateful for the opportunity to talk about some key elements of local water done well. I thought I'd start just by articulating DAA's role in local water done well, just so that everyone has that in mind. So we are the government's policy advisors on local water done well. We also play a role in codifying those policy decisions made by Cabinet into legislation. You've heard earlier today that we're doing that through two bills. There's the preliminary arrangements bill that passed in September, and there's another bill that has been introduced towards the end of November and December, beginning of December rather. We also have a statutory role in legislation to consider and accept water service delivery plans, and you've heard a bit about those this morning as well. And we play a role in working alongside councils to, I guess, help promote understanding of the policy and adoption of the policy, which is why we're here today. So we've been taking note of the conversation, rather than sort of labour the point around different policy, I guess, objectives and purposes. I thought it might be best use of your time to answer or address some of the questions that we've heard raised so far today. I'll start with the easier ones first. One of the councillors raised a question around having access to, I guess, Watercare's reports around the Auckland Transition Agency, the establishment of Watercare, post-implementation reports, those sorts of things. So those are all publicly available online. There's an Auckland Transition Agency website that has all of that documentation, so you're able to publicly search that. I would also say that from a DIA perspective, we have members of our staff who are also involved in the Auckland Transition Agency with the establishment of Watercare, and in one case our Chief Technical Advisor Marlon Bridge has been part of the ATA, been part of Watercare's establishment, and then moved on to be Chief Financial Officer, Chief Customer Officer and Acting CEO of Watercare. So that's one way that we, I guess, hardwire all of those key lessons learned from that experience into local water done well policy. One of the other questions that came up is, will Bill 3 throw up any curveballs? My words. So the short answer to that is no. The longer answer to that question is the policy decisions made for the next bill were made earlier this year. We have proactively released all of those policy decisions, and we've supported that release of those decisions with written guidance and written material to help, I guess, to make it easier for some of those decisions to be understood and reflected in plans as councils work through them. The reason we've done that is we want to provide as much certainty as possible around the legislation that's coming, but also obviously allow enough time for that legislation to be drafted. So that'll be introduced, as I said, late November, early December. The drafting of the legislation is complicated because of the optionality involved. However, it will reflect the policy decisions that have been made by Cabinet earlier this year. And we will again support the introduction of that bill through a range of communication and written guidance and documents that make it easier to consume and digest. There have been a number of questions that I would describe as being related to, I guess, the level of influence, control and accountability. So I just do want to confirm that the policy decision was made that councillors wouldn't be able to be on the board of a water services CCO. However, as owning councils, you will have a number of, I guess, levers and controls and influences in place on how that organisation discharges its duties. As mentioned earlier, as the owning councils, you will decide on the constitution for the organisation and the shareholders' agreement, and you have, I guess, the ability to set those establishment arrangements in place to meet your particular expectations and needs. You may choose to have a shareholders' council. It's not a mandatory feature, but you may choose to have representatives from councils, I guess, who sit in a way between the council and the water organisation to articulate expectations on the professional board that manages and governs the water organisation. The legislation will also include an accountability framework for water services organisations. That will include owning councils having the ability to set a statement of expectations that the water organisation will have to give effect to through its water services strategy. You ultimately have the power to appoint the board and remove directors as owning councils as well. So while the legislation won't permit for councillors to be on the board specifically, you still have a number of levers available to you to exercise your expectations and control and how that organisation discharges its duties. The last one before we open up to general Q&A is related to cost reflective pricing. Quite a few questions today around whether an organisation would be required to harmonise or equalise pricing. So there are no requirements in the legislation to harmonise pricing or equalise pricing. It's a key differentiator between Local Water Done Well and the previous government's policy. The Commerce Commission will play a role in determining cost reflective pricing. So the Commerce Commission will look at, I guess, what is an appropriate price for a region, and that may differ by region. So I just wanted to add to the discourse today that you will have some level of control in setting up those preliminary or establishment arrangements around your expectations for pricing differentiation between regions if you choose to go into a joint model, and the Commerce Commission will also play a role in ensuring that on an ongoing basis the prices charged in a region are reflective of service delivery in that region. Joe, did you want to add anything to that?
I think you got that pretty well. Unless you wanted me to quickly talk about the work that we've been asked to do by the councils. So the work that we've started doing is it's a couple of facets. We've got a financial plan template. It's around financial sustainability. So we're providing that to each council so you can have a look at your baseline current kind of service delivery and go, as we are currently now, would we pass the test or not? Could we submit a plan tomorrow if we had all of the information to go into it? From our initial work for Masterton, that's the case, it's looking pretty good. But then on top of that, what are the benefits and opportunities that Masterton District Council and the other councils individually and collectively would have from adopting a new service model? The major benefits being driven by the LGFA financing solution. More ability to borrow doesn't necessarily mean more borrowing, but more resilience. But then you could utilise that in terms of resetting prices downwards or accelerating investment or other things like that. So we think it's quite important for each council to start with its own position. Go, what would we need to do to be financially sustainable right now? For you guys, I don't think that's much. what would we want to do if we got this additional opportunity and benefit, regardless of what group we're talking about? Because it could be a Masterton CCO, it could be a Wairarapa 1, it could be Wairarapa Tararua, it could be Wellington 10, it could be any configuration. Do I have to go, what's best for Masterton? Is what you guys are interested in, right? So work out what that is, and then you have a baseline which to compare against for you guys, your decision making for your communities, as to what you're getting out of any regional configuration. So that work's still progressing. We can move as fast as we can as information comes to light. It might not have the final report or whatever done in time for your decision, but regardless of what decision you guys make around what you do next in your sort of journey, we're pretty confident that regardless of which way you go, you're going to look okay from the legislative position, and we're kind of here to guide and help.
Okay, so we're open for questions. Thank you, guys. Barbara.
Do DIA have the final say over the governance structure? Like, is there a number that you don't go beyond? Or?
The governance structure in regards to a board of an organisation?
Sorry.
Yeah, so we don't have final say over those. Those are, I guess, decisions for owning councils to make. If I understand the, I guess, the nature of the question, if you're considering a joint model through a water services CCO, LGFA, who would be lending to that organisation, will have expectations around composition of board and competency of board. That's probably, that will be part of the borrowing arrangement that you enter into with LGFA. In terms of number of directors on the board and those sorts of things, I think that's best left for owning councils to decide on.
Thank you. My second question is, you said that if you choose to go into a joint arrangement, so that would suggest that you have a choice to find a guideline. So can you explain?
Sure. Yeah, so I guess the key foundation of local water done well is its local choice. So it is a policy that reflects that councils are best placed to make decisions on behalf of their communities based on your specific requirements and your community's requirements. So that is the foundation of local water done well. There are minimum requirements that need to be met within the policy. So while you have choices, any of those choices that you pursue need to meet those minimum requirements. And so those include things like ring fencing of water revenue to pay for water services. There's an economic regulation regime that'll be introduced that'll have specific requirements. However, the choice falls to you as a council as to what model you ultimately adopt. And so long as you meet those requirements, and from a DIA's perspective, meet the requirement of financial sustainability in your water service delivery plan, and we would accept that plan, and you would be able to, to get on with executing that plan.
I had read your documentation, but I just wanted to make sure, wanted you to say. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for coming along here today. You talked about in the governance side of things with councils, shareholders' council, whatever you want to call it, having a statement of expectations, and then you used the word that to give effect to this. So will that be legislative, or will it be have regard?
The accountability framework itself will be legislated. The specific wording I would need to check on.
I mean, it's been modelled on the arrangements for CCOs, so that you give effect to the expectations, and then the water services strategy.